Hello and welcome to another episode of The Copper Show. Today I'm very glad to say that I've got David Kelly, the CEO of Chakana Copper, who's going to help me understand copper in breccias and breccias around the world and what they contribute to the world of copper production. So David, good to have you on board. Tell me about breccias and let's get started with some of the biggest mineralized breccias. Why do we never hear about breccias, and what are they and where are they from?
Well, thanks, Merlin. It's great to be back on the video with you and talking to you about these things. Breccias and copper ore systems are very prolific globally. Typically you have the porphyry environment, which is where I think about 80% of the world's copper comes out of porphyry mining. A much smaller percent comes out of sedimentary copper. And then, of course, you have the Olympic Dam style or the IOCG style of deposits, which have world-class examples as well. Olympic Dam, Ernest Henry, Candelaria, different types of IOCG systems.
Hang on just for a second, just for the non-geologists. IOCD stands for iron oxide copper gold, and in my understanding, iron oxide copper gold IOCGs, they're effectively quite similar in their aspect and their geometry and their emplacement genesis to porphyries, which is essentially a rising plume of molten magma from within the crust, and that magma chamber kind of settles at around a depth of around 6 to 8 kilometers, and then you get a kind of an apophysis which comes off to a depth of 1 to 4 kilometers, and that's where they kind of the porphyry forms, and it's very similar with IOCGs, but it's just the chemistry of the rocks is different. Am I plus or minus there?
Yeah, there are two different types of IOCG deposits. There are the magmatic related ones, and those are the ones that you referred to. And there are many similarities because of the genesis being related to magmas. There's also basinal fluid derived IOCG systems that have a lot more of a stratigraphic type of control to them. There's similar fluid chemistry, similar alteration styles, but totally different genesis. So it's a very complex ore deposits type. And when Olympic Dam was discovered, they were using a totally different model. In fact, the iron oxide copper gold or IOCG model didn't even exist. It was really that discovery that made economic geologists go back to the drawing board and understand what deposit type it was. And then once they understood it, then many more IOCGs were discovered globally. There's a very extensive belt of iron oxide copper gold deposits in Chile and Peru. That's very well known. And of course, Australia hosts a number of these, Brazil, enormous IOCG deposits. So they're very important on a global scale in terms of copper production, but by far, the largest portion of copper comes from porphyry production.
Just going back to the discovery of Olympic Dam, isn't there some crazy story about the geologist kind of overriding the message from headquarters not to drill that last hole or something at the end of the program? Do you know that story?
I think you're talking about Douglas Haynes, and I don't remember about ignoring orders from headquarters, but that certainly could have been the case because he was very passionate about that target, and he was very, very persistent, which is one of the characteristics of discoverers. They're very persistent in pursuing their thoughts and ideas and stuff like that. So there's a number of Escondida was a discovery based on persistence, and David Lowell had moved on. They had put I'm trying to think. They put 6 holes in the valley between Escondida and Escondida Norte without intersecting the porphyry because they thought there was a leach cap on the south and then one on the north. And so the center was right where they should drill in the valley between. And what they now know is that there were 2 different deposits completely separated by this valley, and they basically drilled in between the two. And David Lowell went on break, and Pancho Ortiz or Francisco Ortiz, they had their own drill rig as part of their roving exploration strategy. And he asked David if he could go drill the leach cap while he was on break. And he said, sure, I'm going on break. You do whatever you want. And that's where the discovery hole at Escondida came from. So, good example of persistence there.
Funny enough, I've just finished David Lowell's book, his autobiography called Intrepid Explorer, which is a really good read. I recommend it to anybody. It's a really interesting read. I think even if you're not a geologist, but I wouldn't know for sure.
Yeah, that's a good one. And Francisco Ortiz also published a kind of a companion discovery history too, and it's slightly different than the story of David Lowell, but it is a great summary of what an exploration goes through, and perseverance is a big part of success in exploration.
But coming back to breccias and porphyries, I've always the strict definition of a porphyry is very hard to pin down. You can basically say that there are a series of common characteristics which include intrusions, cylindrical intrusions, possibly dikes, with mineralization overprinting that, typically a network or a stockwork of mineralization in the middle, concentric alteration around it. It's a kind of a generic definition, and yet, and within that, you can also get these hydrothermal breccias. You can get breccias which are in place in the middle of a porphyry system, but you can also get breccias kind of coming off the top of it, these little kind of plumes and fingers poking off the top of a big porphyry system. And when I think of a breccia, I have to kind of differentiate in my mind between what is a kind of a finger, essentially a finger off the top, which I think of as a indicator of a buried porphyry, and different to a breccia within a porphyry, which can be part of the wider resource development kind of program, commingled ore.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a great definition of a porphyry. And we should also throw out a definition of a breccia. A breccia is simply a term that refers to a rock that's made up of fragments of other rocks. So it's a rock formed from many pieces and fragments of another rock, usually solidified into a coherent body. And there's all different kinds of breccias. There's magmatic breccias, there's hydrothermal breccias, there's fault breccias, there's sedimentary breccias, there's volcanic breccias. There's just a myriad of different types of breccias, and they all tell a different story. The origin of those breccias is very important to understanding the geology and the environment that you're in. And you're right, if you've got a breccia that's coming off of an intrusion, understanding that that's the genesis of that breccia is very important, because that might take your exploration down deeper in that breccia body, hoping to intersect the mineralized intrusion at depth.
Talking about the definition of breccia, of course, the word itself means, in Italian, it means breach. It's an Italian word which means breach, and so it's kind of it's a rock that forms when the pressure conditions constraining a fluid or a group of rocks kind of it's overcome, and then you get this release of pressure, and it rips up and it carries with it a whole jumble of rock fragments which create the rock which we now know as a breccia. Coming to porphyry copper deposits, in my mind I associate breccias with the word tourmaline, which is a boron-rich mineral, and I associate boron with volatiles and scavenging and enriching the fluids at the top of a porphyry system. So I often associate a tourmaline breccia with a well mineralized system, even though you can get tourmaline breccias which don't have copper in them. Is that a fair association?
Yeah, it is. And another way to look at it is a hydrothermal or a magmatic breccia is a function of the release of energy, right? So the greater or more extent of brecciation you have, the greater the energy. And oftentimes the greater the energy input into a mineral system, the greater extent of mineralization. And a great example of that is the Rio Blanco Los Bronces district in central Chile. It's the world's greatest accumulation of copper on the planet. It's 242 million tons of contained copper, and half of the contained copper in that district is hosted in breccias. So breccias are very, very important on a global scale in terms of the contained copper in porphyry environments, and as well as in these IOCG environments.
How did you become an expert in breccias? Was it because your project Soledad had breccias, or was it, did you choose the Soledad project because you were an expert in breccias?
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert in breccia, and I hate to tell your listeners that since I'm on the Copper Show here, but I can tell you I've learned a lot about breccias since we've been exploring the Soledad project. It's a tourmaline breccia system with some very high-grade copper, gold, silver breccia pipes, but a lot of my knowledge about tourmaline breccias came from Doug Kerwin, and Doug is a renowned expert. Doug is a relentless economic geologist that's constantly trying to learn more. I just reached out to Doug today, and he's in the middle of a 4-week field trip looking at copper systems in North America. But Doug, did his master's thesis on tourmaline breccias back in the 60s. He's never told me the exact date, but it was a long time ago, he tells me, at James Cook University. And that kind of sparked a lifelong passion for trying to understand these tourmaline breccia systems. And he's probably seen more tourmaline breccia systems globally than anyone I know. And Doug was a founder of Chakana Copper, and it was so instrumental for us to have the input of somebody like Doug on the project early on because of his knowledge of these tourmaline breccia systems. But a lot of what I know about tourmaline breccias come from Doug and in the active exploration we've done on our project.
I've actually got one. There we go. Look at that. That is I think it's a tourmaline breccia, which is running 5% copper and 1 gram gold and 20 grams silver. The black mineral, I think, is the tourmaline. Obviously, if you can get 20 million tons of that, you're in business. But quite often, and it sounds as if the Rio Blanco Los Bronces breccia is vast, but quite often these are small features. And am I right in thinking that at Soledad, you've essentially got kind of some fingers, some little plumes, which are high grade but small tonnage? For me, what I always want to see in a copper project is decent scale and decent grade. And these breccias, you get the grade, but I struggle with my head around the scale of these things. I mean, you've mentioned Rio Blanco and Los Bronces at the kind of at the big daddy end.
Yeah.
What happens at the smaller end? How do you get enough material in a series of these small things to kind of get enough momentum or critical mass to develop an asset? Is that possible?
Yeah, and the difficulty there, Merlin, is you never really know until you do the exploration, right? So you can apply your learnings from these other districts, and the one thing we know from Los Zapatos is that that's a 2-kilometer vertical extent of tourmaline breccia.
Where's that?
2 kilometers. Sorry?
Where's Los Sulfatos?
Los Zapatos is in the Rio Blanco Los Bronces district. That's the Anglo-American discovery. That's 1.2 billion tons of 1.46% copper, an absolute monster. And that does terminate at depth into a mineralized porphyry. So the important thing there is, as I mentioned, the energy, the brecciation in that case went 2 kilometers vertical. Well, at Soledad, we've drilled a 900-meter hole. We have open-ended breccia at 800 meters depth, and we don't know where the bottom is. So in terms of scalability, you have to consider what's the vertical extent of your mineral system. In our case, our mineral systems are these tourmaline breccias that potentially go into a mineralized intrusion at depth. Vertical extent is important. We also often see, and it's a very common characteristic, if you go to read the Silito and Sawkins paper, 1971 in economic geology, which is kind of the seminal paper on tourmaline breccia systems, they often talk about these breccias getting shaped like a cone. And we think that's related to the energy. As you're getting closer to the energy source, the shape of the breccia is mimicking the shape of the cupola zone in the intrusion. So if you've got a pencil-like intrusion, your breccia pipe is going to start with that kind of diameter and go vertical from there. If you have a larger Pluton type of accumulation with volatiles on the top of that, you're going to have a much bigger breccia body extending vertically above that. That's potentially what happened at Los Sulfatos. But as you go vertical, these things don't reach surface. So they, by definition, come to a point, and that point is going to be fairly small. And one of the things that we've learned at Soledad is numerous economic geologists stood on those same breccia outcrops that we've now drilled to, in some cases, 700, 800, 900 meter depths. And what they didn't appreciate was how vertically extensive they were, and how in several cases the breccia pipes are actually getting bigger at depth. So that addresses some of the scalability questions that you were posing.
Interesting. And one of the other things I'm switched on to at the moment in this kind of general copper market is grade, because a lot of the porphyries that are being drilled at the moment, in some ways it's relatively easy to find a porphyry. In some ways it's relatively easy to find a low grade porphyry. You can put together big distances of 0.2, 0.3%, but every 0.1%, you add on to that, they become increasingly scarce. I mean, if you just look at the average grade of mines being developed around the world, I mean, it's fallen by half in 40 years. It used to be 1%, and it's now 0.45% or something. I mean, it's to find a resource which has got over 1% copper, or 1.5% copper equivalent, is increasingly rare. But I think they should be prized, because grade is also a key factor.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they say that grade is king. Obviously on the economics, it's very important. You can have smaller operations that have exceptional profitability, and one of the things that comes with smaller high grade ore deposits, and we know that very well from high grade skarns and VMS deposits, is oftentimes the capex is much smaller. The environmental and social impact of that mining operation is much smaller and better contained. We've even looked at the environmental impact. I mean, if you think about the production of copper from 1% copper ore bodies versus 0.28%, which is very common grade in southern Peru at the moment, just think about the carbon footprint of mining low grade copper versus high grade copper, right? So there's all kinds of benefits to grade, and we believe it's very important, and we're trying to focus on high grade systems. And it doesn't have to just be high grade copper. It could be good grade copper, but also with good grade gold and silver. Oftentimes supergene enrichment gives you that grade enhancement. Breccias themselves oftentimes enhance the overall grade of a porphyry type of deposit. So there's a number of ways to upgrade a standard low grade porphyry, and breccias are a very important way of doing that.
You mentioned VMS deposits, or those volcanogenic massive sulfides or volcanic hosted massive sulfides. They can be very rich. I've been working on one in Ecuador which is 5% copper equivalent. It's also quite common for those kinds of deposits to have relatively complex metallurgy, in the sense that these form close to the sea floor, either at or below the sea floor. And so there is circulating groundwater, there is changing chemistry, there is quenching of these hot fluids, and kind of very, very rapid precipitation, potentially, which can lead to intergrowths, that can lead to almost alloys or very, very fine-grained minerals, which can generate problems in the co-mixing of the zinc in the copper con and copper in the zinc con, etc. Is it oversimplistic to kind of give an opinion on the mineralogy of hydrothermal or of these kinds of breccias that were associated with porphyries?
Well, the one thing we know for sure is that the closer you are to the porphyry environment, which by definition is you're getting hotter, right? You're going towards the intrusion. You typically assume a mineralogy that's very common with porphyries. Chalcopyrite being your predominant copper mineral, pyrite being your non-economic sulfide mineral. Well, usually with trace amounts of 0.02% or 200 ppm molybdenum. Okay, and in the form of molybdenite, which is a molybdenum sulfur sulfide mineral. So you get very simple mineralogy as you get right on the heat source. As you get more distal to that, and you get more intermediate temperatures, and you get a mixture of different types of fluids, meteoric fluids being pulled into the mineral system, you can get more maybe intermediate sulfidation mineral assemblages, which is more different. In addition to chalcopyrite and pyrite and molybdenite, you might start adding things like tetrahedrite, sulfur salt minerals. We see things like belandrite and bornonite. And the reason that becomes important is because, we have overall strong grades in copper, gold, and silver. And from an economic standpoint, you want to be able to extract all of the valuable metals in the deposit. As you get even more distal from the porphyry environment, you go into the epithermal. You might go through skarn environments if you've got receptive carbonate host rocks. And then you might go into high sulfidation epithermal environments, things like Yanacocha being one of the biggest high sulfidation deposits in the world, predominantly gold, silver mineralization, has arsenic, antimony, those types of pathfinders related to it. Beneath that, you can get significant copper mineralization. So you tend to have these zoned districts where you have the higher temperature deposits and the metal association, intermediate temperatures, and then lower epithermal temperatures. And so it's important to sort out the mineralogy and the zoning you have in your deposit and trying to optimize the metal recoveries you get in the metals that are important.
Goodness, that's not the answer that I was expecting. But it's a complicated sector. Just on the kind of the Tourmaline breccias that you've been working on at Soledad, what's the principal? I think you've got 50% by value in copper, 40% in gold, and 10% in silver. What are the kind of the value minerals that you're dealing with?
Yeah, so chalcopyrite is our dominant copper mineral. We do see a little bit of chalcocite, which is the supergene enrichment product. When you oxidize chalcopyrite, move it down and reprecipitate it in the beneath the groundwater table, it turns into chalcocite, which is a very high grade copper mineral, excellent metallurgy. But those are our predominant copper minerals. Gold, interestingly, oftentimes when you have copper gold systems related to an intrusion or a porphyry environment, oftentimes the gold goes with the copper. So you might have 0.2 grams per ton gold in the chalcopyrite. But we don't see that at Soledad. We actually have blebs of gold in the kind of 20 to 100 micron range in pyrite, visible with standard petrography. And we've done tests on recovering that gold, and it's leachable. You can leach the gold out of the pyrite. We also have a very impressive late gold event where we see free gold cross-cutting sulfide grain boundaries in some of the breccia pipes. And we're doing a geometallurgical study right now through Codes University and at the University of through Codes at the University of Tasmania, supervised by David Cook. And that PhD study is looking at the mineralogy and the deportment of copper, gold, and silver in the various mineralogy that we have.
Good. chalcopyrite is kind of what I was expecting that's kind of the answer that I was expecting from a Tourmaline breccia. Just one thing, away from Tourmaline breccias, or away from breccias per se, just in terms of the copper porphyry world, just in terms of the copper porphyry world, the association between copper and gold and copper and molybdenum, am I right in thinking that it's very rare to get a porphyry with both with gold and molybdenum? It's either copper moly or copper gold.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the best examples of a deposit, porphyry deposit that has significant enrichment in all three metals, copper, moly, and gold, is the Bingham deposit in Utah. Some people attribute that to the slightly alkalic nature of the intrusions that Bingham is associated with. That could be the case. But generally, in the porphyry world, you have two types of porphyries. You have copper gold porphyries and you have copper moly porphyries, and they occur in very distinct metallogenic belts. So generally, when you're in a copper gold fertile porphyry environment, all the deposits will be kind of similar. British Columbia is a great example of that. The Southwest Pacific deposits are they're often associated with oceanic island arc type of environments as opposed to continental arc type of environments. But yeah, there are a small handful of very significant deposits that have all three, but typically it's two of the metals going either copper gold or copper moly.
And when it comes to exploring for porphyries and exploring for breccias, what are the tips and the techniques? Do you use the Tourmaline breccias as a vector for porphyry exploration? What are the ways that you can explore for Tourmaline breccias?
Yeah, so the first thing is all Tourmaline breccias are important. They represent a very high energy brecciation environment related to an intrusion that can be very strongly mineralized. But even if they're not strongly mineralized, they still are important because they tell you had a very, very high energy brecciation event related to an intrusion. And if they're post mineral, in other words, they are formed right after the mineralization event, they very well can be non-mineralized, but they can vector you towards the intrusion, which can be associated with very significant mineralization. So they are a very important vector. In the case of many of the Tourmaline breccia systems around the world, you find the Tourmaline breccias and then you start looking for the intrusion, and oftentimes discoveries have resulted from that.
One of the beauties about a porphyry is that they've got these huge concentric alteration patterns. So there are cubic kilometers of rock which are altered. But you just mentioned that people find Tourmaline breccias. Is there an exploration technique for finding those breccias?
Well, I wouldn't say nothing other than what traditionally would be done. If you're new into a terrain, my background is in exploration geochemistry. The first thing I like to do in any exploration project, either small or regional, is to have good, reliable stream sediment coverage. I'm a big fan of heavy mineral concentrates because that allows you to see the sulfide or the oxide phases related to sulfides, and you learn so much from the mineralogy early on in a program like that. If you're dealing with scarring environments, if you're dealing with high sulfidation or porphyry environments. So that's a very important base layer, I think, to have. Certainly, Tourmaline breccias occur in porphyry environments that have giant alteration halos. So just vectoring towards, getting into the giant footprint of the alteration, then finding tourmalines. In fact, those heavy mineral concentrates I mentioned, oftentimes you will see tourmaline is a heavy, dense mineral. So you will see tourmaline in your heavy mineral concentrate. So it's another great way to find them early on in your program to know what to go look for. But good standard exploration techniques. Airborne magnetics is obviously key in identifying intrusive centers and getting focused in on these intrusive environments, alteration, strong geochemistry, and you'll start finding the Tourmaline breccias once you're there.
Good. And I know that you at Chakana, you're about to be drilling. You've got this big gold target, the mega gold target. Are you doing any drilling of breccias this year? Is that part of the plan? I know we've just been talking about breccias.
Yeah, we are. In fact, this next drill program we're going to test 3 different target types. We're going to test more high grade breccias. We have what we call the Estremadura, very hard to say word, but it's a local name. Breccia pipe. It's got multi-gram gold right at surface, artisanal mining that exposes copper oxides. So we know it's another one of these mineralized breccia pipes at surface at Soledad. That's one of our targets that'll be tested early on. We've got the La Jolla high sulfidation epithermal environment that has very, very pronounced vuggy silica. It's a lithocap environment. We see high sulfidation alteration mineralogy, things like dickite and zunite and diaspore, perophyllite, those types of minerals, which are very favorable and very strong silver grades and gold.
Any alunite?
We do see lots of alunite, absolutely. So that's another very exciting target for us, and we think it's related to the overall Soledad mineral system. It happens to be at the highest elevation and the most distal to the south, which is where you would expect it based on zoning away from a central intrusive environment. And then we've got the mega gold target to test, which is a 2.5 kilometer by 1 kilometer gold anomaly associated with it's hosted within an intrusion that's an early intrusion. So we have something else that's intruded that's caused it. We think it potentially could be a mineralized porphyry or an intrusion-related gold system like a Fort Knox or a Donlin Creek, like the type of reduced gold systems you see in Alaska. We don't know what it is yet because it's not what's causing the very strong geochemical enrichment and the geophysical anomaly is not exposed to surface, but it's very well defined in our exploration, and it will be drill tested along with these other targets.
Well, onwards and upwards, get the drills turning, hit the rocks. What we're looking for is scale in grade and the right mineralogy as a starting point.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, just to get back to your theme of the talk today, breccias are very, very important in a number of different ore systems, not just copper systems, but zinc, gold, silver, even nickel systems can have very important breccias associated with the intrusion. So breccia is a good thing. I remember early in the days of starting Chakana, I went and visited an investment group, and the guy was confused by the word breccia, and he said, "Well, I seemed like I remember something being bad about breccias and to stay away from them." I was dumbfounded. I really didn't at the time. I wasn't expecting something like that, and I probably didn't answer it as well as I would today. But some of the world's biggest ore systems in multiple different commodities are breccias, breccia pipes, breccia related systems. So it's a very good system, but you do have to know how to interpret what the breccias mean. And there are some great experts out there. Doug Kerwin's one, Kevin Heather's another one. Those two guys have talked about teaching breccia workshops that just teach people how to interpret breccias and the different origins and stuff like that. So there's some exciting things happening out there. I guess
one of the key features is that you touched on it earlier. It was about the high pressure environment. You've got a high energy system. Where there's tourmaline, you've got a lot of volatiles. You've got boron. You've got the scavenging system. So you've got a high energy system. You've got a liquid system. You've got a highly reactive fluid. And when a breccia forms, it's because there's a failure limits have been breached. Failure limits of the constraining rocks have been overcome, and so you've got this release of pressure, which can shoot up to the surface where there's lower lithostatic pressure, where you've got less overburden, less constraining pressure from the surface. And the three ways that you can precipitate minerals out of or crystals out of a solution is by changing the chemistry, by changing the temperature, or by changing the pressure. And I guess a breccia just thinking about it, is perhaps the most dynamic way of instantaneously changing pressure across a big system, which would cause many minerals just to dump out of solution, which is where you can get kind of widespread wholesale precipitation of a copper mineral, say. And you can get these repeat phases, particularly in the Greisen. I think we kind of, if you think about the pressure build up off batholiths, but you can get repeated changes of pressure which can repeatedly dump out these mineralization. Sorry, I've just been going off. I've just suddenly been realizing what you've been talking about, that this is a breccia is the kind of the energy transfer. It's the reduction of pressure that can cause the precipitation of the minerals that we're really interested in.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and it's so important to interpret those breccias to the fullest extent that you can, analyzing the composition of the clasts in the breccia, and are they from the host rock or the wall rock that's just adjacent to the breccia, or are they exotic clasts? They come from some unit geologic environment at depth and been brought up into this environment. A lot of times with the you talk about porphyry exploration and using tourmaline breccias as a vector, one of the key things people are looking for is, can they see stockwork porphyry clast in the breccia? And if you see that, that's like the holy grail of tourmaline breccia exploration. If you see that and you see stockwork veining with chalcopyrite, you know you've got a mineralized intrusion at depth. So that's an important part of it. But breccias are fascinating rock types, and they tell a story, and you have to be able to decipher what they mean.
David, thank you very much for guiding me through it. It's been a really enjoyable half an hour or so. Good luck with the exploration program that's coming up.
Thank you, Merlin. Always great to talk to you.